October 12, 1944, Norfolk, Virginia. 47 German women stepped off a prisoner ship onto American soil. Their hearts pounded. Their throats went dry. What they saw in the next 60 seconds would shatter everything they believed about the war. The harbor stretched endlessly before them. Warships lined the docks like iron giants standing shoulder to shoulder. Massive cranes swung through the air, lifting cargo that weighed tons as if it were nothing. The ground itself seemed to shake with the roar of machinery. Factories pumped out tanks and planes at a speed that made no sense. One woman grabbed her friend's arm. Her voice came out as a whisper. "This cannot be real. They told us America was weak, but it was real. And what these prisoners would see over the next few months would change them forever." If you love history that digs deep and tells the truth, please subscribe and like this channel. Your support keeps stories like this alive. The morning air bit cold and sharp. Salt from the Atlantic Ocean hung thick in the breeze. The SS Bremen groaned as it pulled into port at Norfolk Naval Base. Rust streaked down its steel sides. The ship had been at sea for weeks. On deck, 47 German women prisoners stood in thin coats. They pulled the fabric tight against the wind. Their fingers were numb. Their faces were pale. These women had been captured across France, Belgium, and inside Germany itself as the Reich crumbled. For years, Nazi officers had told them the same thing: America was soft. Americans loved comfort too much to fight a real war. They had no stomach for sacrifice. They were weak, distracted, divided. The women believed it. Why wouldn't they? It was all they had ever been told. But as the gangplank lowered and they prepared to step onto enemy soil, everything they thought they knew began to crack. The dock was alive. Hammers slammed against steel hull plates. The sound rang out like church bells, steady and endless. Diesel engines coughed black smoke into the sky. Cranes lifted wooden crates the size of small houses and swung them onto waiting train cars. The air smelled thick: tar, grease, hot metal, salt water. It was overwhelming. For women who had lived through years of rationing and shortages, the sight was impossible to understand. This was not scarcity. This was abundance. One of the prisoners, a woman named Ingrid, would later write in her diary, "We expected emptiness. We expected weakness. Instead, we saw a harbor more crowded with ships than Hamburg ever was, even in its best years." The truth hit them like a punch to the chest. They had been lied to. The Norfolk shipyard alone employed over 40,000 men and women. They launched a Liberty ship every 4 days. By the time the war ended, American shipyards would build over 2,000 vessels. 710 of them would be combat ships. Germany's entire wartime production could not match what this one harbor was doing. A U.S. Navy lieutenant walked down the gangplank toward them. His uniform was crisp. His tone was polite but firm. He was not hostile. He was not cruel. That quiet civility made the prisoners even more uneasy. Their boots clattered on the wooden dock. Their eyes darted everywhere. Soldiers stood at ease nearby. Behind them, cranes swung. Cargo nets bulged with supplies. Half-built ships rose from the water like metal skeletons coming to life. The German women said nothing. The only sounds were their footsteps and the constant slam of shipyard machinery in the background. For the Americans, this was just another day. For the prisoners, it was a revelation. They noticed small things, things that told bigger stories. A line of trucks sat idling nearby. Their fuel tanks were full. Their canvas covers were new. Stacks of fresh uniforms sat on wooden pallets, piled waist-high. Back in Germany, people had been rationing soap and sugar since 1940. Here, everything seemed brand new. Everything seemed endless. One prisoner whispered to another, "This is not possible." Another woman clutched her scarf tighter, as if trying to shield herself from something more dangerous than the cold wind. What unsettled them most was this: none of it was staged. The Americans were not putting on a show. This was just normal life. This was what America looked like during wartime. A Red Cross observer stood nearby. His job was to make sure the prisoners were treated fairly. Later, he would write in his report, "The women seemed lost. Not because they had been captured, but because of what they were seeing." The docks themselves seemed to communicate a power greater than any weapon. As the prisoners were led toward waiting buses, they caught one last look at the horizon. Ship masts and smokestacks stabbed into the sky like a forest made of iron. None of them would ever forget it. But this was only the beginning. Their journey inland would take them deeper into the heart of American industry, and with every mile, the gap between what they had been told and what they were now seeing would grow wider and sharper. The convoy rolled out of Norfolk just after noon. Two military jeeps led the way. The buses followed behind, painted olive green, their windows streaked with dried salt from the sea. Inside, the German women sat in silence, their eyes stayed locked on the world outside. They had expected to find poverty. Instead, mile after mile, America revealed itself as a war machine without limits. The first shock came only minutes after leaving the harbor. More shipyards stretched along the coast. Smoke and steam rose from metal frames where workers welded steel plates together. Sparks rained down like fireflies. Rows of Liberty ships stood in different stages of construction. Some were just skeletons of ribs and metal, others were almost ready to launch. A young woman among the prisoners had been a signals officer. She had studied naval production tables back in Germany. Her voice shook as she whispered, "One shipyard here has more hulls than all of Kiel combined." She was right. Norfolk alone produced dozens of destroyers, carriers, and support ships by 1944. Across the United States, shipyards were producing 18 million tons of shipping every year. That was 6 times more than Germany's entire wartime output. The rhythm of hammers and rivet guns echoed through the bus windows like a heartbeat made of steel. As the convoy moved inland, the landscape changed. Docks gave way to factories. Smokestacks rose on the horizon. Warehouses sprawled across acres of land. Their walls were stenciled with names the women barely recognized from captured documents: Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. One prisoner later recalled, "It was as if every town was a military base. Every street was a supply route. We realized then that our newspapers had lied to us. This was not a soft, distracted people. This was a nation at war." The roads themselves seemed part of the machine. Highways carried streams of trucks loaded with crates, tanks, spare parts. Gasoline, so rare in Germany that doctors rode bicycles to hospitals, flowed freely here. It fueled an endless movement of men and materials. The women smelled it as the convoy slowed through a depot. Sharp, sweet gasoline fumes hung in the warm autumn air. One of the American drivers, a sergeant named James Foster, chuckled when he heard a prisoner gasp at the sight of hundreds of trucks parked nose to tail. Under his breath, he muttered, "Lady, this ain't even half of what's on the road." To him, it was ordinary. To them, it was unthinkable. At a rest stop outside Newport News, the buses idled beside a rail yard. Long lines of boxcars and flatbed cars stood ready. Each one was marked with white chalk: Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis. Cranes loaded crates stamped with serial numbers. The operation was smooth, organized, relentless. In Germany, chaos ruled. Bombing raids disrupted shipments. Shortages forced people to improvise. Trains ran late or not at all. Here, the logistics were clean and efficient. The prisoners exchanged glances. Several of them were trained analysts. Their value to Berlin had been their ability to read production capacity from small details. What they saw now, the frequency of trains, the volume of materials, the neat stacking of goods, told them one thing: the enemy's resources were massive, far beyond what Germany could match. One woman scribbled into a notebook that was later recovered, "We thought America was a land of consumers. It is a land of producers. Every factory we pass is another nail in our coffin." And yet, strangely, no one seemed to be showing off. American civilians along the route went about their lives. Workers in coveralls walked to job sites. Children played near the roadside. Women carried groceries home. There was no strain, no exhaustion, none of the hollow-eyed weariness that had taken over German cities by 1944. Instead, life seemed normal. Vibrant even. The prisoners could not understand it. How could a nation fight a global war while still feeding its people well, while still clothing them, while still building highways and bridges as if peace had never ended? By the time the convoy reached Richmond, the women had gone completely silent. The shock of the harbor had settled into something deeper, a quiet, sinking realization. What they had seen in a single afternoon was more than Germany could produce in a year. Their faith in propaganda, that America was soft, incapable, divided, was melting away like frost under the Virginia sun. But the journey was not over. Ahead lay the prisoner of war camps themselves. And there, another paradox waited for them. one that would shake them even more. The buses turned off the main road at dusk. Gravel crunched under the tires. The convoy approached a sprawling compound ringed with barbed wire. The women braced themselves. They expected filth, overcrowding, cruelty. German propaganda had described American POW camps as little more than cages where prisoners were left to rot. But as the gates swung open, they saw something completely different. The barracks looked more like a college campus than a prison. Neat rows of wooden buildings stood in clean, straight lines. The roofs were tarred and waterproof. Smoke curled from chimneys. The smell of warm bread drifted from a nearby mess hall. Beyond the barracks were tidy gardens, a field marked for sports and recreation. One woman, a nurse named Hildegard, muttered under her breath, "Impossible. They live better here than our own soldiers at the front." Inside the processing center, the shock deepened. Each prisoner was assigned a number. They were photographed. They were issued fresh bedding. Then came the medical inspection. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a Navy physician, conducted examinations with calm professionalism. She checked their teeth. She listened to their lungs. She noted malnutrition in almost every case. Through an interpreter, she said to one of the women, "You've been living on 1,200 calories a day. Maybe less. Our men get twice that, even in the field." For the Germans, the contrast was humiliating and humbling. Back home, rations had shrunk to thin slices of black bread. Ersatz coffee made from acorns, watery stews with no meat. Here, even prisoners were measured for proper shoes. They were vaccinated against disease. Ingrid wrote in her journal that night, "They treat us like patients, not enemies." It is an insult and a mercy at the same time. The paradox did not stop with food or medicine. That evening, the women were led to their barracks. Clean cots with wool blankets waited for them. Soap and towels were stacked in neat piles by the washroom. A Red Cross representative explained that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to basic dignity. The Germans stared in disbelief. Their own government had signed those conventions. Yet Soviet and French prisoners in the Reich starved in open fields. The numbers told the story clearly. In American camps, German POWs received an average of 3,500 calories every day. That was more than many American civilians got during rationing. In German camps, Allied prisoners often starved on fewer than 1,000 calories. One prisoner confessed in a hushed voice, "If Berlin knew the truth, they would never forgive us for surviving this well." The sensory details burned themselves into memory. The smell of clean sheets, the taste of white bread and butter at supper, the clatter of stainless steel cutlery, all of it was a symbol of plenty. In one corner of the mess hall, a prisoner broke down in tears after biting into an orange. It was a fruit she had not seen since before the war started. "To us," she whispered, "this was luxury beyond reason, but the treatment was not soft. It was disciplined. Guards maintained order firmly. Escape was not tolerated, but the civility itself was a weapon. A quiet demonstration of American confidence. As one U.S. officer remarked casually, "We can afford to treat them well. We are not afraid of them." The women lay awake that first night. They listened to the low hum of a generator in the distance. They heard the occasional bark of a guard dog. For some, it was the first uninterrupted night of rest in months. For others, it was torture. To be shown humanity by the enemy made the Reich's brutality harder to defend, harder to explain. But what they had seen so far, the harbor, the highways, the barracks, was only the surface of America's power. Soon they would hear something even more unsettling. Voices crackling across radios and telephone lines. A communication network that stretched across an entire continent. A system that revealed a coordination beyond anything they thought possible. The morning began with the bugle call, sharp and clear against the autumn sky. After breakfast, eggs, toast, and hot coffee that tasted like luxury itself, the prisoners were led into a common hall. There, for the first time, they heard something they had been told could not exist. The open pulse of American communication. Radios hummed, telephones rang. The steady clatter of typewriters filled the air. For women trained in signal work, radar operations, and logistics, the soundscape itself was a revelation. They leaned forward, their ears sharpened. Through the static of a shortwave radio came voices speaking in clipped English. Weather updates from Kansas, shipping manifests from New Orleans, naval traffic reports from the Pacific coast. What shocked them was not just the amount of information, it was how unguarded it all seemed. One of the prisoners, a former radio operator named Lot, whispered, "They don't even bother to hide it. They broadcast openly because they can afford to. In the Reich, secrecy was everything. Lines were tapped, codes were layered, paranoia governed every transmission. Here, the openness was both confusing and terrifying." A U.S. Army sergeant noticed the women staring. He explained casually, "This is just routine. We've got thousands of stations. Thousands of lines, every state, every base, every ship. We're all connected." He shrugged as if he had said nothing remarkable. But for the prisoners, it was staggering. Germany's communication networks, crippled by constant bombing and shortages, could barely maintain contact across its shrinking empire. Statistics confirmed what the women were realizing in real time. By 1944, the United States operated over 400,000 telephones in military service alone. Civilian lines numbered in the tens of millions. In contrast, the Reich had fewer than 2 million functioning telephone lines. Many of them were in cities that had already been reduced to rubble. The prisoners were allowed to send letters home under Red Cross supervision. Some even dictated messages to clerks who typed them on clean stationery. Ingrid recorded later, "To touch a telephone, to see a letter carried freely, it felt like civilization again." And yet this freedom was what we were taught to despise. The paradox cut deep. Their captors' generosity only highlighted the emptiness of their own regime's promises. The sensory experience reinforced the lesson. The steady buzz of switchboards, the metallic snap of plugs being inserted, the constant whir of paper-fed teletype machines. It was a symphony of efficiency. The women realized something profound. This invisible infrastructure was as powerful a weapon as tanks or planes. Wars were not only fought with rifles, they were won with coordination. Hildegard, the nurse, later confessed in a post-war interview, "I had believed America was disorganized, lazy, without discipline. Instead, I saw that even their voices had order." The war lived in every telephone line, every radio wave. It was inescapable, but the Americans were not showing off. To them, this was routine, normal administration. That normality rattled the prisoners most of all. If this was the background noise of a single camp in Virginia, what must the full network of the United States sound like? That evening, as the women returned to their barracks, the paradox weighed on them like a stone. They had been captured soldiers. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they were being given glimpses of a system so vast it seemed casual in its power. For the Reich, secrecy was armor. For America, transparency was strength. And soon, the proof of that strength would become even more visible. Their next journey would take them into aircraft hangars. There, the scale of American air power, measured not in whispers and signals, but in steel wings and roaring engines, would shatter their illusions even further. The first thing they noticed was the smell, thick with oil, rubber, and gasoline. A scent so strong it clung to their clothes long after they left. The convoy of buses pulled up beside an enormous corrugated hangar. Its doors yawned open like the mouth of a giant beast. Inside, wings gleamed under overhead lamps, engines hung from cranes. Teams of mechanics swarmed over fuselages with a precision that looked almost rehearsed. For the German women, most of them raised on stories of Luftwaffe superiority, the sight was a shock. In their minds, German aircraft, Messerschmitts, Junkers, Focke-Wulfs, were still unmatched. Yet here stood rows of American bombers and fighters, not hidden away in secrecy, but out in the open, by the dozens, maybe by the hundreds. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien, tasked with escorting the prisoners, walked them down the hangar floor. He was a cheerful Irish-American with grease on his sleeves. He had no sense that he was revealing anything remarkable. "This one here," he said, slapping the flank of a B-24 Liberator, "can be replaced in 3 days if it's lost. 3 days, ladies. That's how fast we turn them out." The words hit harder than any bomb. 3 days. In Germany, aircraft factories were shattered by Allied bombing raids. Spare parts were scarce. Engines often took weeks to assemble. Some planes were cannibalized just to keep others flying. Here, the idea that a lost bomber was simply a line item to be replaced staggered them. Numbers backed up O'Brien's boast. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. That was more than Germany built in the entire war. At its peak, a new plane rolled off American assembly lines every 5 minutes. The contrast was obscene in its scale. The sensory details made the truth undeniable. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns echoed through the hangar like machine gun fire. But instead of destruction, it was creation. The air shimmered with heat from arc welders. Mechanics shouted to one another over the roar of test engines. The very floor vibrated with industry. One of the prisoners, Lot, the radio operator, muttered, "So many. And still more coming." Her voice trembled, not from fear of the guards, but from the sheer realization of what she was seeing. Hildegard, the nurse, confessed in her journal, "Our leaders told us America was weak and willing to sacrifice, yet here, sacrifice was invisible. It was production, not desperation." What struck them most was the casualness of it all. Workers joked. They shared cigarettes. They wiped sweat from their brows, as if assembling aircraft was just another day's work. To the Germans, who had been told every German worker was pressed to their absolute limit, this ease was unnerving. How could a people so relaxed produce such overwhelming force? O'Brien, noticing their awe, leaned closer and said with a grin, "You think this is big? You should see Detroit. This hangar is nothing. Just a drop in the bucket." He chuckled and walked away, leaving the women in silence. The paradox hung heavy in the air. For the Reich, every lost plane was a national tragedy. For America, it was an inconvenience fixed in days. That difference alone signaled how the war would end. As the women were led back out into the sunlight, the roar of an engine test firing shook the ground beneath their feet. The sound followed them onto the buses. It rattled in their bones like a prophecy. But their education was not finished. In the weeks to come, they would be shown something even harder to deny. Photographs and reports of American bombing campaigns. Proof that this industrial power was not just theoretical. It was reaching deep into the Reich with devastating precision. 3 weeks passed in the camp, a strange limbo of routine. Regular meals, medical checkups, carefully monitored recreation. By now, the German women no longer jumped at the sound of American trucks or the bark of orders in English. But the moment that changed their understanding most profoundly did not come from what they saw in person. It came from what they were shown on paper. One morning, they were gathered in a small hall. U.S. intelligence officers spread photographs across long wooden tables. The pictures were black and white, crisp, devastating. They showed German cities from the air. Factories before and after bombing raids, rail junctions in ruins. Synthetic fuel plants cracked open like eggshells. "This," said one officer in a measured tone, tapping a photo of the Luna works near Merseburg, "produced most of Germany's aviation fuel. Or rather, it used to." The image beside it showed twisted steel, shattered pipelines, plumes of smoke frozen mid-rise. The women leaned over the photographs in silence. They had been told by Nazi broadcasts that Allied bombing was random, clumsy, largely ineffective. Yet here was evidence of something precise, calculated, relentless. One after another, the photos reinforced the point. A ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to rubble. Bridges across the Rhine snapped like matchsticks. Rail yards in Cologne littered with craters. A prisoner named Martha whispered, almost to herself, "So that is why our trains never come." Statistics confirmed the pictures. By mid-1944, Allied bombers were dropping over 200,000 tons of explosives on Germany every month. Aircraft losses were high, but American production, those hangars full of bombers they had already seen, made the losses sustainable. Germany, meanwhile, could not replace its fuel or machinery. Every blast photo laid bare the truth. The Reich was bleeding out under skies it could no longer control. The sensory impact was undeniable, even in still images. The women studied the jagged white scars of bomb craters against blackened earth. The skeletal remains of factories once buzzing with life. One wrote in her diary later, "I could almost smell the smoke rising from the paper." What shook them most was the casualness with which the officers presented the images. This was not theater for their benefit, it was routine analysis. Something the Americans sifted through daily. To the prisoners, each photograph was a dagger. To the officers, it was just another report in a stack of thousands. One officer explained without malice, "We don't need to destroy everything. Just the fuel, the bearings, the bridges. When those are gone, your armies can't move." His words were clinical. But to the prisoners, they carried the weight of inevitability. Ingrid wrote afterward, "It was not hatred that defeated us, it was arithmetic." The paradox was stark. German propaganda painted America as reckless and chaotic. Yet what the women saw was cold, disciplined precision. When the session ended, the women walked back to their barracks under a sky streaked with contrails. For the first time, they felt as though the very clouds belonged to the enemy. The Reich had told them the skies were theirs. The truth was written in smoke above their heads. But this new knowledge carried a moral dilemma. Should they keep silent, protect the illusion their country still clung to, or should they speak, risking accusations of betrayal? That question would come to a head with the arrival of a letter. One that would test both their loyalty and the Americans' willingness to expose the truth. The letter arrived on a gray afternoon. It was slipped under the door of the barracks like contraband. It bore no official stamp, only a faint pencil scrawl across the envelope. Hildegard, the nurse, picked it up first. She turned it over in her hands. When she unfolded the paper, the women crowded around her like moths to a flame. It was from another German POW camp in the United States, smuggled through a network of prisoners who had found ways to communicate. The message was short, written in hurried German script. "Hold fast, the Reich is pushing back on all fronts. New weapons will change the war. Do not believe what the Americans show you. Victory is near." The words echoed the same promises they had heard before capture. Yet now, after the hangars and the photographs, the sentences rang hollow. The letter's tone of desperation was louder than its bravado. Lot, the radio operator, shook her head. If we were winning, they would not need to write this. But Hildegard pressed the paper flat on the table, frowning. Still, it is what our families are being told back home. What if they believe it while we know something else? The tension in the room thickened. Their lives in camp were already shaped by paradox, treated better by their captors than by their own regime, fed regularly while their families starved, shown truths that contradicted the Reich's iron propaganda. Now, the letter threatened to drag them back into the shadows of belief. That evening, an American lieutenant, one of the officers, who had shown them the bombing photos, addressed the women. He had the letter in his hand, clearly intercepted. "You don't have to believe me," he said. His German was halting but clear. "But you should know this. We do not show you lies. We don't need to." He then laid a fresh set of photographs on the table. These were even more recent. Rail depots in Frankfurt reduced to rubble. Columns of smoke from Hamburg that seemed to stretch into the sky forever. The contrast between the smuggled letter and the stark images could not have been sharper. For the first time, one of the prisoners, a woman named Greta who had been silent for weeks, spoke firmly. "If Germany has such weapons, why do they not stop this?" She tapped the photo with a trembling finger. The silence that followed was heavier than any guard's command. That night, few of them slept. The sound of distant engines from a nearby training airfield rolled through the darkness like a reminder. Their dreams were filled with smoke, factories collapsing, and the nagging thought that perhaps loyalty had become nothing more than a habit of fear. The letter had intended to restore their faith. Instead, it cracked it further. The question of what to believe no longer had an easy answer. And in the weeks ahead, as American guards began allowing more controlled visits into local towns, the contrast between propaganda and reality would deepen until denial was no longer possible. Spring 1945 brought with it a strange silence. The barracks that had once buzzed with rumor and disbelief grew quieter with each passing day. Newspapers, deliberately left in common rooms by American officers, announced the fall of one German city after another: Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt. Each headline was a nail driven into the coffin of certainty. By April, whispers reached even the German women POWs. Hitler was dead. The Reich, which had claimed it would last 1,000 years, had collapsed in barely 12. The women sat on wooden bunks, staring at one another, unable to reconcile the world they had been raised in with the world they now saw crumbling. Ingrid wrote in her diary, "We came here as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to rule Europe. Now I see only that we were children fed stories while America was building a world beyond our comprehension." The U.S. Army began preparing the prisoners for repatriation. The women were issued clean uniforms. They received medical checkups. They were given rations for the voyage home. Some wept at the thought of seeing family again. Others feared what awaited them in a defeated, starving Germany. For all of them, the journey carried a haunting paradox. They were leaving behind comfort and order in the land of the enemy. They were returning to chaos in their homeland. Before departure, a Red Cross officer presented Ingrid with a decision. She could carry a message home, not a personal letter, but a report to German authorities. Washington had debated the risk. Would her words be dismissed as enemy propaganda? Or could they serve as proof of the futility of resistance? Ingrid's account was brief but unflinching. America's strength is not a lie, it is everywhere, in their machines, their factories, their food, their unity. To continue this war is madness. When the ship carrying them docked in Bremerhaven, her report was sent up the chain of command. The reaction was predictable. German officers dismissed it outright. They labeled her either a traitor or a gullible woman seduced by American trickery. The truth was too large to fit into their shrinking ideology. But for the women themselves, the truth could not be erased. They had seen aircraft rolling off assembly lines faster than they could be destroyed. They had eaten meals more abundant than their families could dream of. They had walked streets where children played without fear of air raids. What they carried back was not just memory, it was comparison. A living contradiction to everything the Reich had promised. Years later, some of them would tell their children and grandchildren about that surreal journey to America. They did not speak of humiliation, but of awakening. They recalled the clang of shipyard hammers, the endless rows of tanks, the freedom of speech they overheard in every cafe and on every street. These were impressions that no photograph or speech could erase. They had come as prisoners of a regime that called itself invincible. They left as witnesses to its delusion. And in the end, it was not America's bombs that most unsettled them. It was America's abundance, its relentless capacity to create, its refusal to bow to scarcity. This was not propaganda, this was reality. They had come expecting conquerors, they left as students. In the final tally, America's greatest weapon was not its arsenal. It was proof that freedom, when matched with industry and will, could outbuild any tyranny.